let me welcome you all to this event on the imperative of resurrecting multilateralism. In his address at a recently held meeting of the ASEAN-India network of think tanks, Indian Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar remarked that multilateralism has failed the test as the world lives through an unprecedented challenge in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, which has thrown up trust as the most valued commodity in international relations today. And I underline the word trust. Just when multilateralism was most in demand, it did not rise to the occasion. It saw little leadership. It was not just due to the admittedly anachronistic nature of key international organizations. Equally, it reflected the intensely competitive nature of current international politics he emphasized. This sums up the current state of the world, and there is a remarkable similarity between the world that we are witnessing today and that about a century ago, during the interwar years, which resulted in the demise of the League of Nations. While at that time a rising power refused to join the International Committee of Nations, this time another rising and expansionist power is doing everything that goes against trust. It is in this context that we need to understand the implications and aftermath of a number of disruptions that the world has witnessed recently, starting with an expansionist approach in the South China Sea and in the Himalayas, and followed by Sino-American trade and technology war and the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a complete disregard to a rules-based multilateral system of governance on the part of the regime, which ironically benefited most from it in the sphere of trade, connectivity, and poverty reduction. Thus, what is needed is trust building among the nations for the delivery of global public goods in a fair and equitable manner, so that there is peace, security, stability, and prosperity for all. That is possible if a better sense about the virtues of being a good international citizen prevails. The question is, can it happen? What should be the role of traditional as well as emerging powers to make that happen? It is time for all of us to seriously ponder over the UN system and advocate for necessary reforms in the UN Security Council, including inducting India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan as its permanent members. With that, let me conclude my opening remarks and hand over the proceedings to Sabina.
Great. Thank you so much, Pradeep. I'm so grateful to CUTS for inviting me to be the moderator for this session. It is wonderful to be here with such esteemed and experienced panelists, and personally heartwarming to see Pascal, Lamy, and Bruce Stokes, two people who have been mentors for me in my professional career. So I'm really happy to be here. It's an honor. Thank you so much. I think the discussion we are about to have today could not come at a more pressing time. At the very moment that the world needs multilateral cooperation to combat some of our biggest threats, like of course the pandemic and climate change, nations have locked down and are actually looking inwards to protect their borders, protect their public health, their jobs, their markets. But we would be remiss to if we didn't acknowledge that multilateralism has been weakening for some time now. This is not a new phenomenon since the pandemic, but it's been a gradual decline for some time now. And in my view, the critical question is why? Why is this the case? The very title for this session, The Imperative of Resurrecting Multilateralism, assumes that everyone agrees that resurrecting multilateralism is an imperative, right? But there are many that have lost faith in this notion, and the question is why? Is it because multilateralism in the post-World War years had a purpose when nations had to cooperate to build and to rebuild? But today, even though our economies are more connected than ever before through technology, through data flows, through trade and value chains, and to a lesser degree through the movement of people and migration, the underpinning values of nations is more about competitiveness rather than cooperation? Is that the reason why? Or is it because multilateralism sounds great and works as an ideal, but in practice, the UN is unable, the UN, which has sort of come to embody the multilateral spirit, is unable to enforce a cooperative agenda because it relies on member states for its dues? Or is it seen as a hypocritical body that propagates, for example, gender equality in SDG 5, but studies show that the UN itself lacks gender parity in middle management and up, and men are 2.5 times more likely to receive appointments and 3 times more likely to receive promotions at the D2 level, men are than women? Is the UN seen as a place where diplomats with tax-free salaries preach development while sitting in fancy air-conditioned 5-star hotel rooms? The question is the UN, is multilateralism today seen as an ideal, or is its operational value recognized? Does it practice what it preaches? And is it equipped? Is it the right forum to address the cross-national global challenges that we are confronting, the biggest 2 of which at the moment are right in front of us, the pandemic and, of course, the looming existential crisis of our time, which is climate change? These are tough questions, but only when we are willing to acknowledge that there are problems with the current system can we actually start discussing how to fix it. So it is really my pleasure to have what I hope will be a very candid and open discussion with veterans of the multilateral world. It is my privilege to start by introducing Pascal Lamy, who was the former Director General of the World Trade Organization and is currently the chair of the Paris Peace Forum. So Pascal, let me start with sort of a question that I'm actually going to pose to all the panelists, which is, why is multilateralism seen as failing? What are the key reasons for this? And why is support for multilateralism waning? So let me start with you and get some of your words of wisdom on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. Thanks, Pradeep, for convening us. I'll try to answer your question while starting from the same point as the one Pradeep mentioned, which is that this crisis, this COVID pandemic and the series of crises it has triggered is probably the lowest point in international cooperation for the last 40 years, at least in my own experience. And I spent roughly 30 years in international issues. I've never seen such a low level of cooperation. And that's a very, very worrying sign. Now, what's behind this? I will agree with Sabina that it's a long process, that COVID in a way reveals things which had been going for some time. I will mention 3 basic reasons, 2 of which are medium long term, structural, one of which is hopefully more temporary and conjunctural. The 2 long-term reasons of the difficulties of multilateralism are first divisions among major sovereigns, which are the backbone of the multilateral system, which is based on sovereign nation state interacting with each other. This is the reality. It's called the Westphalian model. It started in 1648, and we haven't changed the basic software of the international system since 1648, which I think says a bit on why we have a number of problems. The reality being that as long as it remains based on sovereigns interacting with each other, if interests all values of sovereigns differ, then multilateralism has a problem. And I think the reality is that as compared to 30 or 40 years ago, both the interest and the values have diverged rather than converged on this planet, not least because of an increase of inequalities, which is a fundamental feature of market capitalism. And you know, I'm not a big advocate of this, although I recognize that everything we've tried to substitute it has so far failed. But this is, I think, the main substantial reason of the problems of multilateralism: highly and increasingly divergent, both interest and values, like human rights, among sovereigns. The second reason is a more a more operational one, although it has something to do with the first one, which is that I believe that instruments of international cooperation, the sort of not software but hardware of multilateralism and international cooperation, is probably now largely obsolete, as A, it remains based on diplomatic systems, and B, treaties and international institutions are, in my view, instruments which are not the ones we need today, although we need some, but we need more than that. And by the way, if we look at institutions, we know that the clout, the capacity, the impact of a large number of these institutions are still severely limited by their member states. So on the one side, we have a system which is based on sovereignty, and on the other side, we have a system where sovereignty limits the progress of the institutional and legal part of the system. Third and last point, and this is my last point, we have a conjunctural, hopefully temporary, specific coefficient with the attitude of the Trump administration, who is the first ever big power since multilateralism was invented, who started from an ideological point of view, which is that multilateralism is bad for this big power. And of course, the moment one of the major actors indulges in trying to rock the system, in trying to damage the system, in the name that its country will be better without multilateralism than with multilateralism, or with multilateralism on my own terms, of course, this is one more major problem. I'm saying, hopefully this is temporary, although we all know that this is a very open question. So I think this answers roughly your question for the purpose of our debate, inevitably in a sketchy way. But if you look at tax, if you look at environment, if you look at migration, if you look at cyber, if you look at data, which is the sort of universe of where I think we still have big holes in the system, those are the explanations why we still have these big holes.
Thank you, Pascal. Bruce, let me turn next to you and ask you, it's good to see you, ask you the same question. You know, I think Pascal has really hit on the heart of the problem with multilateralism as it exists today, being a sort of tension between tackling global challenges that require cooperation without an architecture that is based on cooperative interests, but is rather based on sovereignty and national sovereignty. So let me turn to you, and perhaps you could agree, disagree, or build on what Pascal said in terms of what you see as being the biggest challenges with multilateralism. Why is it seen as failing, and why is support for it waning?
Thank you, Sabina. It's great to see you, and great to see Pascal and Pradeep and everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I guess a couple of things sparked by what Pascal said, and then I would like to share with you some views on at least the perception of multilateralism in the United States, which is somewhat separate from what the Trump administration is pursuing, because I think it does give us some reason for hope. I think the central problem we face in the world today is we have global problems that cannot be dealt with except in a global sense. Climate change being a perfect example, COVID being a perfect example. But we have to think globally and act locally, to go back to an old phrase that's been around for a while, in the sense that one of the shortcomings, I think, of multilateral institutions is, and frankly, many institutions at the national level, is that faith in those institutions has declined because they aren't producing results for people that people tangibly see. And I think we can rail about the inequality of these institutions, or they don't have the right people sitting around the table, or they, overpay their staff, or whatever we want to do to complain about them. But I think that it may be a more fundamental issue that you can't solve these problems without a mobilization at the local level, which does not currently exist. And in fact, it flies in the face of at least Western two-valued logic, which is things are either centralized or they're decentralized, but they can't be both. And I think that we have to accept the fact and begin to get our heads around the fact that things need to be centralized to a certain extent because they're global problems that can't be dealt with except cooperatively. And they need to be decentralized at the same time, because that's the only way to have an effective impact on the problem, and also to develop faith by people on the ground that actually the problem is working, and that those who are working on the problem are working in their interest. That's a broader kind of how do we reorganize the world problem that probably goes beyond multilateralism. But I think that what Pascal was saying earlier on when we were privately talking about the need for I think he called it polylateralism, is exactly where we should be headed. Now, I do want to challenge one of the premises that, at least in the United States, that there is a decline in the faith of multilateralism. I think that, yes, if you compare it to the late 1940s or early 1950s, yes, the public opinion data suggests there has been a decline. In recent years, there hasn't been a decline. I think what we see more in the public opinion data is a lack of understanding and a lack of belief that this relates to me as an institution. We in the United States, I must admit, don't pay enough attention to multilateral institutions, so we don't even ask questions about multilateral institutions in public opinion polls for the most part. The best time series in the United States is by the Pew Research Center, where I used to help run the international polling. And in September of 2019, 59% of people had a positive view of the United States. This was relatively unchanged for a decade and a half. Now, what was more significant, though, was that only 39% thought strengthening the UN was and should be a foreign policy priority of the United States. So even though people had a positive view, relatively positive, it hadn't changed that much. We can debate whether 59% is good or bad. They don't put a high priority on fixing it. I think it's in part because the UN is not, people don't understand what the UN does. I have thought that because in the United States, UNICEF stopped collecting money on a door to door on Halloween. For those of you who are not Americans, the kids used to go around and raise money for UNICEF every Halloween. My guess is that's probably the only time in a given year that most Americans ever heard of the United Nations. And now even that has stopped. So I do think there is that lack of connectedness. In terms of the World Trade Organization, people basically don't even ask questions about the World Trade Organization. I'm not sure if you ask a knowledge question, people would know that it existed. But The Economist and YouGov did a poll in December of 2019, and 39% said it was good for the US, 25% said it was a bad thing for the US, but 36% had no opinion. So again, I think that it shows just a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. And a pro-trade business group did a survey more recently, the Heinrich Foundation, and 36% of Americans supported leaving the WTO, 28% opposed leaving, and 35% were indifferent or unsure. Again, almost the same result. We don't even know anything about this organization to make it worthwhile to have an opinion about it. Now, what was interesting in their survey is that when they primed the audience and explained to them what the WTO did, then about half the respondents said, oh, this should help US companies compete, and it help us avoid unfair competition by foreigners. So people are open to being convinced that this is at least somewhat of value to this multilateral organization is somewhat of value to the United States. But there's really so little knowledge. Pascal, I'm sure, encountered this again and again. Even at elite levels, there's very little understanding. The U.S. wins most of the cases that it brings, and it wins most of the cases that are brought against it. I mean, it has been a positive benefit for the United States. Now, the World Health Organization is the other multilateral organization that has been in the news lately, with the Trump administration threatening to pull out and criticizing the World Health Organization. Interestingly enough, 55% of Americans still have a favorable view of the World Health Organization. What is, I think, significant is that 63% of Republicans have an unfavorable view, which means the president's beating up on the World Health Organization is working and driving public opinion. And of course, we know with this president, when he sees something that works with his base, he doubles down on it. So I do think that we can expect more of this going forward, and it's led to other perverse outcomes where only 43% of Americans trust WHO medical advice. Again, it's hard to have a multilateral institution that's trusted when you don't trust their advice when on issues that and 36% approved temporarily suspending donations to the WHO. Now that's only a third of the population, but I dare say that the question would have never even been asked before the Trump administration, because it was a no-brainer that we would donate to the World Health Organization. And of course, the importance of this erosion of support for a multilateral institution is that we need the WHO or something like it to mount the effort to vaccinate the world once we have a vaccine for COVID. And if, to go back to the old phrase, if it didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. And I think that is the good news is, I think, in talking to advisors to the Biden campaign, a lot of this posturing towards the multilateral system will change. But that's good. That's all for the good as far as I'm concerned. But I do think we need to be cautious because, for example, I had a conversation recently with a senior Biden advisor who was not a trade expert, because you want to separate the people who have a vested interest in these things from other people, who said, yes, we'll get back engaged in the WTO. We want to fix the dispute settlement mechanism. We want to fix the negotiation system, and we expect to fail. And then we don't know what we're going to do. And I think that is, that's a cautionary note to us all, that Biden will have a different posture towards multilateral institutions. That's all for the well and good. But the problems of those institutions remain. And it's not at all clear that even someone who's committed to multilateralism can fix them. So on that sober note, I'll close.
Hey, thank you so much, Bruce. And my familiarity for you actually led me to ask you a question straight away without actually introducing you. So please forgive me. For all of our participants, Bruce Stokes is the Executive Director of the Transatlantic Task Force. Together or Alone, that's the name, at the German Marshall Fund. And he's also the former director of the Pew Research Center's Global Attitudes Project. So thank you for bringing a lot of insights also from your years at the Pew Research Center. And again, Bruce, I'm sorry for sort of skipping right into the subject and not introducing you ahead of time. Before I move forward to our next speakers, I wanted to give Pascal a chance. Pascal, if you want to quickly respond, Bruce raised a lot of, I think, observations and substantiated by data on sort of the perceptions of the WTO and lack of familiarity with the WTO and potentially the new administration's agenda. So do you want to respond to anything that Bruce said before we move forward?
I mean, I agree. I mean, the sort of fact which Bruce has mentioned, which is that many people do not know the World Trade Organization or are not aware that there is a World Trade Organization, in a way is something that has never really surprised me. After all, most people would believe that they don't need the World Trade Organization to trade. Why do we need something that is a World Trade Organization? And when you ask people in the streets who know WTO or believe they know WTO, they believe it's a sort of huge sub-Earth Pentagon in Geneva, where lots of people and computers and people working on air, sea, road are running trade internationally, which is totally weird. So the reason why we need a World Trade Organization, which is that given the way market capitalism works, it's better to open trade, but in a way that preserves fair competition, so that you need rules to do that. Otherwise, it's the law of the jungle. This is something which is already incredibly complex. If I have to go on TV and explain in 35 seconds, which is usually the time you have on TV, what is the World Trade Organization about, it's very difficult. So I'm not surprised about this. Not that this WTO is a perfect thing, far from that. And recent times, I'm afraid, have rather deteriorated its stature, impact, and relevance. And I'm probably not totally objective, given the time I spent with this organization in a previous period. But what's not surprising me in what Bruce says is that people are aware of a World Health Organization and more positive to it than people who are aware of the Trade Organization and positive to it. I'm not surprised about this. I'm surprised that the US elected a few years ago a president that campaigned on a fully protectionist platform, which had never happened since 1900. This is a big turnover, which I think also explains part of the problems we have.
Great, thank you for those insights, Pascal. It's very interesting to get your perspective on, how the WTO is perceived from your vantage point. And I, at some point, would like to challenge you to explain what it does in 30 seconds. But for now, I would like to move to our next speaker, who is Ambassador Jorge Heine, who is a research professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies, Boston University, and was the former ambassador of Chile to India. So Professor, Ambassador, over to you to give us your perspective on why is multilateralism seen as failing and why is support for it waning?
Thank you, Sabina. And thank you to Coach International and for Pradeep for inviting me to this very distinguished panel. Good morning. It's great to participate in an event hosted from India, country where I spent 4 wonderful years of my life. So, let me cut to the chase, and in an effort to add some value to the already very insightful presentations that we have heard. The question becomes, in some ways, why the crisis of multilateralism now? Why is it so acute? We have heard about a number of issues within the United Nations. We have heard about the issue of sovereignty that goes back several hundred years. But the real question, it seems to me, why the crisis now, just at a time when, as it has been said, we most need it with the pandemic, with COVID-19. And here I have a somewhat different take in terms of, a lot of people simply blame the Trump administration or the United States, perhaps a fluke election that is behind all that we are seeing here. I have a somewhat different perspective in the following sense. It seems to me that the crisis of multilateralism that we are seeing today is in some ways, in effect, the result of globalization as it has developed in the course of the past few decades. And what we have is something that I find very striking. The initial view of globalization in the 90s, in the early 2000s, if we remember the WTO meeting in Seattle, the basic view was that globalization was going to favor the North, that it was going to be a scheme whereby Western multinational corporations would make even more money. It would extract profits and surplus value from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia. Well, guess what? Something funny happened on the way to globalization as is happening now, and that is that it ended up benefiting not only the North, which it did, but also benefited quite considerably countries in the global South. China and India, of course, at the forefront, that have done very well in the course of the past 20, 25 years. We have seen the numbers on how poverty has been reduced and how the tremendous progress that we have seen in both countries, but also in other countries in the global South. And that, of course, has also had a negative impact in some sectors of the northern economies, which have lost jobs, particularly in manufacturing, but also in the service sector. And I would argue this goes beyond just the United States. I would argue that it has hit particularly badly the Anglosphere, meaning the United States and also the UK, countries that within the North have had weaker social safety nets. And therefore, workers that have lost jobs have been more exposed to the vagaries of unemployment or low wages. And the result of that has been a very strong reaction against globalization, against international organizations, against anything foreign. Basically a very chauvinist, nationalist, nativist reaction that has led to what we have seen in the United States, but also in the UK. I would argue Brexit is a foremost example of that, and also in some other European countries. And that, it seems to me, provides the context for this reaction that we are seeing. And let me zero in on a very specific example. I happened to be in India both in 2006, when President Bush visited, and in 2010, when President Obama visited. None of them visited on those occasions Bangalore, which is a city that is visited by most heads of government and heads of state when they come. When I hosted President Lagos, who undertook the first presidential visit from Chile in 2005, we did Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, and Agra. Why didn't President Bush or President Obama go to Bangalore? There is a verb in the United States which is to be Bangalore. When you are terminated, when you lose a job, and the person that replaces you is based in Bangalore. Therefore, there's obviously a very strong prevention on the part of the White House to ever setting foot in Bangalore. But the example I'm trying to underscore is that it seems to me, is very much at the root of what we are seeing. And this results in a very strong anti-foreign, anti-international organizations, anti-UN attitude. There is political capital to be made by denouncing the United Nations, by denouncing the WTO, by denouncing the World Health Organization. You gain votes by doing that. And that is, we are seeing, this is something we're seeing in the United States, we are seeing in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. And this is not something that will go away. Mr. Trump may lose the next elections, but this feeling, this is something that is there. And his or her successors will continue to make political capital out of that. And that, it seems to me, is something that we cannot lose sight of. Now, in that is the context, it seems to me, in which the reaction of the international organizations of multilateral fora to the current pandemic has been so weak and so dismal. This is the worst humanitarian crisis that we have seen since World War II, according to UNSG. Yet, the Security Council of the UN didn't meet for several months after the pandemic hit us. The G7 foreign ministers meeting couldn't agree on a communique. The G20, led by that great forward-looking country that is named Saudi Arabia, has been totally on the sidelines, hasn't done anything, basically, in this major crisis. Some say the worst crisis in a century. So this failure of multilateralism, of multilateral organization, it seems to me, has to be explained in this context. Now, what happens, and I will speak later on the reaction in the Global South, but what is particularly baffling to many countries in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia, the way I see it, is that it is the very countries that set up this system that are now trying to tear it down, that are now taking the hammer to destroy it. So what do? Some years ago, you were told, this is what we must do. We need a World Trade Organization to channel trade to prosper. We need a World Health Organization to prevent pandemics. And now, these very same countries say, no, we must tear them down. It's everyone for himself. Now, what do if you are in government in a small country like Chile? One reaction, obviously, is, well, let us stand up for these organizations. Let us defend multilateralism, because that is where our interests lie. But the way this works, and we are seeing this these days, is that the big powers have all sorts of side payments that they can make to divide the countries in the South, and thus be able to continue with this destruction. It would be a different thing if countries in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa could act together. But they are divided by side payments that are made by the big powers as they proceed in this destructive effort. So it's a very difficult picture, and I hope we can continue to elaborate on it in the rest of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jorge, really quickly, before I move to Mrs. Puri, I just want to ask you, so, thank you for adding what I think is a very important insight on the waning of multilateralism as being a product of dissatisfaction with globalization and in some ways what Pascal was also underscoring, market capitalism leading to inequities that people are ascribing to globalization in a way, and those aren't necessarily the same thing. But my question to you is a short one, if you could answer it kind of quickly, is the multilateral system responsible for globalization?
No, I wouldn't say that the multilateral system is responsible for globalization. Globalization is a deeper process, that has its own dynamics and its own roots. But obviously, the multilateral system is part of it and works with it. I mean, the WTO facilitates globalization, and makes a number of things possible that otherwise wouldn't happen. But I wouldn't say it is the root cause. It is something that is associated with, but it is not necessarily at the roots of.
Okay. Thank you for that. So last but not least, in fact, saving the best for last, I would like to turn to Mrs. Lakshmi Puri, who's the former Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations and the former Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. So thank you so much for joining us, Lakshmi. I have actually two questions for you. The first is, the question about what is the problem with the multilateral system? Why is it seen as failing? And why is support for it waning? And second, I'd like to sort of ask you, what do you think are the general underpinnings of a multilateral system that would be successful for a 21st century economy that on the one hand is facing all of these different challenges that are global, but on the other hand is sort of looking inward at its own sovereign agendas? So I'd love to hear from you on sort of what are the problems with the current system and how can we kind of look to multilateralism as helping navigate these global challenges at a time when countries are looking inwards. Lakshmiji, you're on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself. Okay.
So thank you so much, Pradeep, and the distinguished panelists, friends from Geneva, New York, elsewhere in the multilateral cosmic space that we have been together. Let me begin by saying that I am a believer in multilateralism, and therefore I'm very happy to join this panel and talk about resurrection, though I would rather talk about rebirth. But in any case, what does multilateralism mean? It means the coming together of great, medium, and small powers to establish universal, rule-based, and equitable institutions of global governance for serving public good and aggregate welfare of people everywhere. And this is based on what I would call one planet solidarity. And we've just heard how that is not really working out. And that's one crisis. But multilateralism is, for me, and I'm coming more from the UN sphere as well, a civilizational distillation of values and norms. And if that is in crisis, it puts our civilization on trial, So this is the first point I would like to make. The second thing is multilateralism anchored in the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions is a global governance universe that was established 75 years ago and has spawned a web of specialized institutions. Some of them we referred to. And they have covered almost every area of global political, economic, social concern. Also, the UN, I think this was also referred to, the UN BWIs are a creature of the member states. But it is also the interplay of the three, for example, in the case of the UN, and it is true of the BWIs, we are talking here about the three UNs. The governments, what Mr. Lamy called sovereigns, the people, we the people, which the charter referred to as we the people, the civil society, the public opinion, and how the people see it. And the third is this, the secretariats. If they work in tandem with each other and in the right way, then we can see a very credible and effective multilateralism. So, but that's something that is an emerging flaw in the system. Also, as has been pointed out, it is the power play of dominant member states that critically determine its success or failure. Now, there is universal angst about the crisis in and of multilateralism. And I would like to stress both in and of. Let me say that even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit and created a multidimensional existential crisis for countries like India, for example, but I know that many other countries are in that same boat. UN at 75, the WTO in particular, and even the multilateral financial institutions were in crisis, if not paralysis, on so many fronts. So what happened was the discontents of globalization, and I entirely agree with Jorge, the discontents of globalization fueled by the pandemic of social inequality, as the UN Secretary General has called it, and as has been referred, and jobless growth, and the so-called, and the structural changes that have been mentioned, and the so-called national to global trade-offs, and I want to emphasize this, on global public good issues like climate change and trade, you know, the yellow shirts in Paris, for example, you know, protesting against climate change action. So these are the people, we the people in major countries like the US, but there are other countries also who have had these kind of reactions that have, and these are the countries, as has been mentioned, who are the leaders and pillars of multilateralism. And that's where this insurrection has taken place against the concept of global good and everything that multilateralism represents. Then on Trump, I think you've referred to various aspects of Trump and how he made the big change, but Trump became the totem pole of these discontents with multilateralism. He, as you said, he became, his base was already there. So US, the leader of the liberal democratic global order and values that the UN and the BWIs are meant to represent. So this is something very important, the liberal democratic order that was meant to, and values that this was meant to represent, was already resorting to transactional unilateralism. Even before, to some extent, you know, there are examples of President Obama as well. Something was mentioned before, but under the America First banner, it became even more intensified. Then people in the US, but also in Europe and elsewhere, saw themselves at the receiving end of globalization, as has been mentioned, qua multilateralism's losses. Because, you know, we always keep saying you have the losers and winners of globalization, and multilateralism is somehow equated. And thus far, these losses to a large extent were borne by less powerful countries. But now, blaming the gaming of multilateral rules. You said that, yes, developing countries benefited from multilateral rules. But then some, like China, gamed it, is the perception that was widespread and to some extent correct. State trading organizations, enterprises, everything, the transparency, opacity issues. So the same rules they had shaped, which earlier on had enabled them to be prosperous and economically and politically powerful, now they became against that system. And so we have a phenomenon of at least a culture of deglobalization, as Walden Bellow has called it. And it was hastened by the crisis and reaction to China's using weaponized interdependence, as some have called it, and its geo-economic networks for geostrategic purposes. This is a very important shift that has happened and which has impacted multilateralism and its credibility. And it was seen also in the context of WHO as much as WTO. Then as you rightly said, a World War III, like COVID-19 disaster, triggered a geopolitical, financial, economic meltdown and exposed the pandemic of social inequalities and shared fragilities, as has been mentioned. And then we have the great disruption of technology, Tech 4.0. And not to forget the zero marginal cost economy. All of this got accelerated by COVID-19. And it had its own impact also on jobs, on economic well-being. So multilateralism did seem to fail the stress and acid test that this was. And the WHO failed to surveil, give early warning, and prevent the pandemic from going global. And as was mentioned, UN Security Council failed to act on it as a threat to peace and biosecurity, because biosecurity is a major concern. So IMF, World Bank, here I will also go into those areas, fell short on the economic front to mobilize sufficient liquidity and provide concessional financial safety net to help cash and fiscally strapped developing countries. So this is the situation that, you know, governments faced vis-a-vis the multilateral system. And the reaction was, of course, further disillusionment. Then we are also looking at the financial crisis that is already looming, and that's also been caused by this. Worse than perhaps 2008. Then the question of China's increasing weaponization of its economic and trade clout, while being the origin of the virus, and its territorial aggression and expansionism, as was mentioned by Pradeep. After it, and not to forget its revenge observation of the devastation caused in democratic countries like US, India, has led to democracies like India and US to also react, to protect, to seek some kind of health-related autarky in production and access to supplies, to health security related, and then economic security and national security. So the regimes, the trade, investment, technology regimes that privilege China are not the priority right now. And that's why there is a reaction, you know, there is this whole self-reliance kind of wave that is rising. Now, as Alexander Wendt said, the anarchy that we see is what states make it. And in this case, as has been said, the state of big power relations, contestation over institutional capture. And I want to emphasize this because I have been both inside the UN and as a member state interacting with the UN. And I know that there is this race for institutional capture. And between narrow national interests, what you called sovereignty, Mr. Lamy, and the larger global public good is to blame for the crisis in multilateralism. Now, the big powers, they exercised influence through their control over finance, decision-making bodies like the P5 in UN Security Council, in the IMF World Bank board, through their shareholding and financial contribution, and including in the WTO. So this is the scenario within which multilateralism has become what the people see as a global elitist body. And emerging powers like India have tried to influence and reform the institutions. But the rules of the game towards more equity and towards public good decisions as much as possible, but with limited success, given the cards. And of course, smaller powers, countries have used Lilliputian tactics, what I would call, of banding together sometimes in order to wield greater influence in decision-making. So all of that has happened, including in the WTO, issue-based coalitions, et cetera, et cetera. But the margin of persuasion is, of course, limited by their trade weight or their economic contribution or whatever. Now, coming to the UN has achieved much. I think you had asked me also earlier about the peace and the development contribution of the UN. It has achieved much in carrying forward its mandate of global governance and its projects of peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, and humanitarian action through its 4 key areas of action, which are norm setting, conventions, treaties, soft law, then advocacy and movement building, knowledge hub, and also becoming and driving programs on the ground. And whether you look at peacekeeping, there are still 13 peacekeeping operations going on around the world. Whether you're looking at 59 million refugees being supported, whether you're looking at the reducing maternal mortality, ending polio, you look at the whole range of things that UN does. It has made a very significant contribution, and it's not standing up or being able to really account for its Paris Climate Change Treaty, not to forget, the SDGs, promoting gender equality, and I'll come to your question a little later. All of these have shown that UN has an essential role and it has played it. But, and as has been said, we would need to invent the UN if it was not there. But it is of course not perfect, but we can use its convening power for international cooperation, which is enormous in an area of common concern, including the emerging issues like the 4th Industrial Revolution and the governance of that. And then the issue of vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine. Even now, as we speak, there is work going on in cooperating on COVID-19 vaccine. So, however, we also know that, and by Secretary General of UN's own admission, the UN is not achieving its potential. And he says there are 3 main reasons for that. It lacks scale, ambition, and teeth. UNHC, which has teeth, is hobbled by cross-veto or implementation paralysis. Perilous interventions, use of force to change regimes have been undertaken, either with the consent, with the agreement of the Security Council, or using it as a flag of convenience, or despite it's not agreed to it. So these have had disastrous consequences, whether you look at Libya, Syria, Yemen. So these, and also the prevention strategy, the peacekeeping, the peacemaking, very importantly, peacemaking strategy of the UN, the peace building strategy of the UN, agenda of the UN. Member states have not allowed the UN Secretariat or Secretary General to be as active and as successful as he can be. Because, you know, different powers have their own interests. So in short, on peace and security, what is the report card? We have averted World War III, but UN has been ineffective against many regional conflicts, against asymmetrical wars and terrorism. And on disarmament, I mentioned biosecurity. The Biological Weapons Convention needs to be provided teeth, especially, biosurveillance and biosafety concerns have really been raised. We still don't know what happened in Wuhan. And we need to be prepared for any future, biosecurity events. On development.
Lakshmi, should we come back to you in the second round, perhaps? Thank you very much for, I think, what are extremely valuable insights. And, Pascal was writing in the chat box that, not all big powers are against multilateralism or undermining multilateralism. But we'll come back to that. We've been receiving a lot of questions in the chat box, and I've been trying to kind of sift through them as we go through the discussion as well. But Pascal, let me come back to you. And I want to actually ask you two questions. The first is, we've seen in recent years, and I'm incorporating comments from the chat box, and this is open to all the participants. If you have questions, please do put them into the chat box, because I will incorporate them into the discussion. So, we've seen sort of a shift away from, in some ways, from trade being brought forward or advanced through trade agreements between nations, a shift to very fragmented systems of production where a majority of the transactions happen through the private law of contracts between companies and private actors. How do we govern this kind of a world? What sort of mechanisms do we need to evolve in order to be able to govern these kinds of transactions that take place through, in value chains? And with that, I kind of want to pick up on a couple of questions that Jitesh Khosla was asking, which is, in some ways, what is the counterfactual, and I'm paraphrasing here, what is the counterfactual to the current multilateral system? What is, multilateralism 2.0 fit for a 21st century economy that is characterized by value chains, that is characterized by, a lack of biodiversity and the kinds of challenges that Lakshmi ji was just articulating as well. So Pascal, over to you.
Well, two different questions. First, on trade, my view, for what it's worth, is that there is nothing new in value chains. They simply are longer, more diverse than they used to be before. But the fact that value chains brings together private parties that contract with each other is the very basis of trade for now roughly 30 centuries. It's not states that trade with each other, it's traders, it's producers, it's consumers. There's a need for rules of that game. And this is where the GATT and the WTO came from, because in a way, and I'm not 100% Marxist, but it's understandable that global market capitalism, which is the infrastructures of the world, needs superstructures that allow it to work. And these are the rules. Now, I think the basic problem of the World Trade Organization is not the way global supply chains have proliferated. Multi-localization of production systems, goods and services is a direct consequence of technological progress, which crushes the cost of distance, which until now had been a big limiting factor of the expansion of trade. It's just that what limited the expansion of trade for 30 centuries, which is distance, is now disappearing under the impact of technology. where we have problems in the World Trade Organization is, in my view, in two main areas. The first one is fair competition, a level playing field, and the reality is that the coexistence with a Chinese system which is based on state capitalism with global liberal capitalism is now a big problem, which we haven't so far properly solved. So that other than Chinese companies competing with Chinese companies on the Chinese market, or other than Chinese companies competing with Chinese companies in international markets, now have the feeling, which in my view is in many cases grounded, that they compete with the Chinese treasury, which is not the way it should happen. And I think China still has a long way to go to understand that in whatever open global market capitalist system, state aids need to be disciplined. And this is not there so far. And this is a big handicap on the sustainability of an open trade system. Open trade is only sustainable if it works. And if the notion that it develops comparative advantages in a way that is reasonably fair is there. So China is a problem. And China has to understand, in my view, that until and unless they will accept more disciplines on state aids, the way global trade has opened for the last 30 years will not be sustainable. And by the way, we are seeking bits of that. Trump is probably a sort of apocalyptic version of this. But even in Europe, look at what happened for the last 5 years. The openness vis-à-vis China is changing, is becoming more conditional. Now, that's the first problem. The second problem, which is much more complex in my view, because the first one is a sort of normal trade issue between different trade partners. The second problem, which I think is much larger, is not protectionism, including with subsidization, is what I call precautionism. The fact that a large part of obstacles to trade today stem not from the willingness to protect producers, but from the necessity to protect people and consumers from a number of risks, which leads to precautionary measures, standards, safety, security, pesticide residues, size of bumpers, licensing of architects or doctors. And this regulatory way of exercising precaution scatters the world of trade. And the reason for that is that there's nothing like a common global view of what is the right pesticide residue standard in flowers, or what is the right size of bumpers, or what are the right qualification for doctors or accountants. This is the real big problem, which I think world trade has to face. It's a major issue because it goes way beyond the purview and the mandate of the World Trade Organization, which is based on classical obstacle to trade, the purpose of which is to protect producers and not consumers. This entails a new approach, and this is where a multi-stakeholder approach would probably be a better way to address these problems. But we will come back to that at the end of the discussion, when I'm sure both Pradeep and Sabina will raise the question of what to do. And this is my last answer to your sort of counterfactual. I think what we've been saying until now in this discussion is that the real problem of multilateralism is sovereignty of 200 nation states. This is what limits the capacity of the multilateral system to cope with challenges, including global public goods. And if nation states do not agree to share more sovereignty, we have to insert into this game other actors who are ready to share sovereignty, power, influence, such as businesses, such as NGOs, such as big academic institutions, such as big cities. And the way to go, in my view, is to keep this principle, but based on the engagement of actors, sometimes in a more micro way. Although, when you look at the way HIV/AIDS, for instance, was, let's say, reasonably harnessed and tamed, it did not come mostly from sovereign nation states. It did not come mostly from the World Health Organization. It came from a coalition of activists, of the pharma industry, of NGOs. And when you look at, if you compare the UN Security Council composition and the composition of the board of the Global Fund, this is the difference between 1648 and the 21st century. And I think we need to go to something which is more like the Global Fund, with a variety of stakeholders than the classical Westphalian diplomatic base. And again, this is what we are trying to do with the Paris Peace Forum. It works in some areas. We are trying to make it work better in other areas, but it's a way to get things done through another method, through another approach, which in many ways is much more bottom-up than top-down, although working on things like cyber security, for instance, which is a very urgent thing because this is a huge hole in international governance. This is an example where, again, you need various actors around the table. If it's not Russia, US and China who indulge in cyberware, who will voluntarily limit the impact of cyberware. You need other people to step in, other interests to step in. So diversification, I think, is the real counterfactual.
Mm-hmm. That is very, very interesting, Pascal. I think I'm fully bought into your vision of plurilateralism, I think you termed it. So, but the issue of China has come up several times, and so let me come back to you, Bruce, and pick up a question that has come up in the chat box, which relates to China. So has the emergence of a multipolar world caused so much insecurity that the very powers that multilateralism strengthened are now seeking to destroy it? And this was also what Lakshmi ji kind of alluded to in her comments. You know, China has worked long and hard to become part of the WTO. It is now a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It has agreed to emissions cuts and specific targets set out in the Paris Agreement. It has, in fact, these days, been a less outspoken critic of the multilateral system, perhaps because it's used the system to bolster itself, than, for example, the United States under the Trump administration. So I'd like you to kind of discuss this sort of back and forth between China and the United States. And is China today reinforcing or undermining multilateralism? What is its role, especially vis-a-vis the United States? And, you know, again, picking up on the audience question, you know, has the emergence of this multipolar world actually destabilized multilateralism, in your view?
Sabina, I have a point to mention here.
Yes.
What Pascal was speaking about is a new term, polylateralism, and not plurilateralism.
Sorry.
Number two,
Got it.
Number two, what you should be very familiar with, we have not discussed one international organization which is actually an example of polylateralism, the ILO. Thank you.
Well, we can certainly go down the path of discussing the ILO and perhaps
as an example of polylateralism. A live example.
And perhaps a question of whether that has been a successful model of polylateralism or not, right? I mean, that's the key question here. So I love that question, and I'm very happy to delve into that debate. But let me
some other time.
Yeah. maybe we need a follow-up session. And I can already anticipate that if all the panelists are amenable, we might go 10 minutes or so over time. You know, this is a very interesting discussion, if that's okay. But let me give the floor to Bruce quickly to answer the question on China and anything else that you'd like to sort of weigh in on that has been said so far, Bruce. Over to you.
No, thank you, Sabina. And, you know, look, I think China has or is in the process of co-opting the multilateral system to its own ends. And on one hand, we could take the philosophical view that isn't that what the United States did after World War II? So what's to be surprised about this? But since I think at least some of us, myself included, worry about what the Chinese ends might be, then I think the co-optation of the multilateral system, assuming that's what they are engaged in, consciously or unconsciously, I think is something we have to wrestle with and be worried about. You know, they are the third largest user of the dispute settlement mechanism after the U.S. and Europe. They have won about a third of their cases they brought against the United States, which means from an American point of view, we prevail more than they do, but I guess from a Trump point of view, they shouldn't win any cases. So that's probably an issue that is angering Americans. There is some debate about compliance implementation and to what extent they have implemented decisions in a timely fashion and in the way that the winners of a dispute settlement thought they should. But then again, the EU and the US have been fighting over the implementation of the Airbus-Boeing decisions for years and years. But still, I mean, it is one of the problems and complaints about China, at least in the United States. There is the issue of their developing country status, which is unresolved. And I think is a true sticking point as we go forward, because I think, at least in the public's mind, and I think in most politicians' mind, calling China, giving it the benefits of developing country status, which aren't that great actually anymore, but still is symbolically terribly important, and China's been unwilling to give on that. But I think the real thing to watch is China's slow, but I think very conscious and articulated strategy of taking leadership positions in various international standard-setting bodies. And I'm sure from their point of view, they just see it as we are one of the biggest economies in the world. We should lead some of these standard-setting bodies. But since standards are such an important fundamental scene setter for the evolution of technologies and which technologies prevail in the marketplace, the fact that the Chinese now head the International Telecommunications Union, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the UN Industrial Development Organization, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, I think is something that didn't exist before and is a sign of their understanding that there is power through multilateralism when you are in leadership positions in these standard-setting bodies. And I think we in the West have been slow to recognize that. As the head of Samsung said to a European friend of mine at the end of the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, you and the Americans better settle on the new telephone technology standards, or we're going to adopt the Chinese standard. And I think that in a nutshell tells us why those standard setting bodies are important. It's an aspect of multilateralism none of us really pay much attention to, but businesses pay a lot of attention to it. And I do think that, but shame on us if we relinquish our role in those organizations because we no longer see the importance of them or the value, or we don't want to invest the time and money in it, then we are the ones who have abandoned multilateralism to the Chinese. And I think that's not in our interest.
Now, let me bring Jorge back into this conversation, Jorge. I'm looking at the time, and I wanted to start with you by kind of posing the question of, where do we go from here? Essentially, is the pandemic underscoring the need for multilateralism, or is it highlighting the cracks such that it will break the system? Where are we now in terms of multilateralism? We've discussed that issue, but where do we go from here? What are your 2 to 3 key action items to resurrect multilateralism in a 21st century economy?
Okay. Thank you, Sabina. Well, if you look at sort of some of the common parlance and even some of the arguments that are voiced in the realist school and international relations, there's this notion that somehow multilateralism is for sissies, that the real way to protect the national interest is just to stand up for sovereignty and your own. And that is the language that has become quite pervasive. Well, I couldn't disagree more. It seems to me it's not only wrong-headed from an ethical point of view, but also wrong-headed in terms of your own national interest, as it were. Why is that so? I would argue that what we have seen in the case of this pandemic is that the idea that somehow you close your borders and you keep the problems out is, of course, a sham. It doesn't work that way. You can close your borders and the virus will still come in. Now, why is that? Because there's this very mistaken notion that power is something you exercise simply over others and assert your own primacy in your own leadership, in your own hegemony. Well, guess what? We live in an interconnected, interdependent, globalized economy. And real power, in many cases, is not exercised over others. It is exercised with others. This is what is known as network power. And the best example of that has to do, of course, with the vaccine and immunization. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has said that the only way forward is to have the vaccine as a global public good. And she is right, of course, because even if you are the most powerful country in the world and you want to have the vaccine just for yourself, if the virus is out there in the world, it will get back to you and bite you. And what I would like to posit to you is that in today's world, the creation of global public goods and the creation of what has been referred to as network goods, that is, you are safer and you're better off by working with others rather than by trying to impose your will on others, is the way to go. And in the global south, this crisis is not just a health crisis, it's not just an economic crisis, it is as it is everywhere. It is also a social crisis. In Latin America, we have seen somewhere between 25 and 30% of the world's fatalities from the virus, with only 8% of the population. This is 4 times as much as it should be, which gives you an indication of how hard it has hit. Yet, if we look at what is being done globally to cope with this, in the IMF, some countries, some member states put forward the idea of increasing special drawing rights. Yet that was blocked. It was blocked by the United States, which applies its own policy of helping people inside the United States through various programs. But it's opposed to a global program whereby the IMF might help out the rest of the world that is in such dire straits. And again, this is a question of underscoring the need of working together. That is why it seems to me that in today's world, we need to put front and center these global public goods and these network goods. And that is what we need. That is why we would all be better off. And this is not just sort of do-goodism or out of a charitable impulse. It is because it is better for all of us, including the big powers. And that is why we need more multilateralism rather than less. Let me add a footnote to that. In Latin America, which is undergoing now this huge crisis, projections are that this year Latin America will have negative growth of 9%, which is the worst performance of any developing region. And we are in severe trouble. What we have argued with some colleagues and published a piece in the Latin American version of the Journal of Foreign Affairs, that we need to take a page from the history of Indian foreign policy and have what we call an active non-alignment as the way forward. We are caught, Bruce Stokes mentioned the case of China, we are caught in this conflict, in the middle of this conflict between the United States and China. And they want us to choose between the two. And what we are saying is that the only way forward is by looking out for our own position, our own regional interest, and establish a position that is totally independent of these two powers. The standard phrase, of course, is that when the elephants fight, is the grass that gets trampled. And we are in such a position now that we must develop our own very special position in foreign policy, which we call active non-alignment. Thank you.
Yes, Lakshmi ji, I would love for you to just maybe deliver in a couple of minutes, your sort of final thoughts and any reactions that you have. We're a little bit short on time, so you will have the last word on our panel before we kind of turn to the closing. So in a couple of minutes, please.
So that's a difficult thing, but I just want to say three things. First, that one of the major challenges that one will need to overcome to reinvent multilateralism on the lines of, as has been mentioned, global cooperation, solidarity, and I would like to emphasize positive sum interdependence. Not weaponized interdependence, but a positive sum interdependence, is this schism that Jorge has mentioned between US and China. And, this has been referred to by the Secretary General as the Thucydides trap of the rising power and the reigning power or hegemons, contesting each other and creating two parallel systems, and the other countries, middle powers, getting caught in that. And of course, multilateralism will suffer. So the first issue is, how do we negotiate this bipolarity which has re-emerged after 1989? Okay, the end of history that was declared in 1989, 1990. Now it is both ideological. China has really spread its economic empire. 70 countries, it is, in a relationship of almost economic dependency and debt dependency under its BRI, including in Europe. I'm told 16 countries in Europe are connected strongly to China. So that is one. And then it will, of course, have its own consequences. So this is one major issue, that any multilateralism that we try to resurrect or to have it reborn, we will need to deal with this. And of course, there are some ideas, but right now, from the Indian point of view, we see, of course, China in a very, what one would say, in many ways, they want the economic system. They are status quoist on that. They are also status quoist on UN Security Council reform. The G4 have called out to them and told them that they are the only country in P5 that is opposing expansion and reform.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they are revisionist when it comes to strategic issues, whether it's South China Sea or in the Himalayas, as Pradeep had mentioned. So this is a very major challenge to multilateralism, which is to be reinvented. the second quick point that I want to make is that we will need to not think of just tinkering. You know, we cannot go back to archaism, as Arnold Toynbee has said, because we will have to have a rebirth, which means mandate review, which means more representative governance, and yes, more engagement with all the actors that Ms. Lamy has mentioned, and impartiality. And I think some of the areas we are seeking to govern in the future will require this polylateralism, and certainly internet and this whole tech 4 is going to be that kind of space. And then, of course, technical excellence and independence. I think WHO, that was the problem. Strengthening of crisis response capacity, because we are seeing how uncertain things can be, how fragile we are when crisis hits, particularly health crisis. So this is, and financial viability and stability of multilateral institutions and inuring them from great power pressures. These are really important when we want to see a rejuvenated. The last point I want to make is about the UN itself. The UN, we have a provision in the Charter, Article 108 and 9. We should be bold as an international community. I don't know, maybe after November, in the case of US, but whoever comes as the new president, I think we need to really set out a whole new United Nations, using the review conference, convening a review conference, and making sure that we create a new UN, which is even more effective than it has been.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. Thank you so much for that. Pascal, final last words on the, the action items. If you had like a lightning round, what would your 2 action items be?
Well, having listened carefully to this discussion, I think there are many reasons why multilateralism does not work the way it should. And let's look at the whole picture. But there is one thing which I think we all agree on, which is that where there is a big weakness is that it's not properly organized to get things done. It's the delivery capacity which is at stake. Again, whatever reason there is behind this, and many of them have been mentioned, and I would agree that it's a complex game, I think what we have to do is to increase our capacity of getting things done via international cooperation. This is the real problem. And my experience and my sense of the discussions and what I read and what I wrote is that we have not to replace sovereignty, not to replace nation states, but we have to add other actors to this ingredient. Mm-hmm. As long as we rely on the monopoly of sovereign nation state to deliver, it will not work. And there are many reasons why this will even be true in the future. There are many people, many companies, many cities on this planet who have more power than the average member of the UN General Assembly. So we have to reorganize power the way it is structured now. And I think, again, coalitions, engaging people, making sure that this a bit idealistic triangle, which Lakshmi mentioned at the UN, for instance, on the one side, we the people, on the other side, the secretariat, and on the third side, governments, we all know that this triangle is totally flawed in favor of governments. We the people is like this, the secretariat is like this, and the governments are like this. This is what we have to change, I think. And again, that's what we are trying with the Paris Peace Forum. I'm not sure we will succeed, but at least let's try another approach instead of keeping digging in the same hole.
Thank you, Pascal. Bruce, very quickly over to you if you have anything to add in a couple minutes.
Just to reinforce what Pascal just said, there was a Clinton campaign slogan back in 1992, it's the economy stupid. I think for multilateralism, it's delivery stupid. And I don't think we can underestimate the importance that these problems that that average people are facing in the world, they just want someone to solve them for them. And they have to acknowledge they have to be part of that solution. But if we are worried about the decline of multilateralism, it is because other entities, national entities, populists are saying we can solve these problems for you. I think no one on this call believes that, but it has an appeal. And I think multilateralism needs to focus itself on delivery at not the broad conceptual level, but at the everyday level. And I think that, as Pascal has said, this will require the engagement of actors across national boundaries who haven't worked together as closely as they need to in the past. And that is NGOs, that is cities, that is corporations who have worked together very well on crafting rules that benefit them, but now we need to pressure them to work together to benefit consumers, as Pascal has said, because really the challenge ahead is how do we create a regulatory framework for global commerce that average people believe benefit them. And to say that it brings them lower prices, we know from surveys we did at Pew, people do not believe it brings lower prices. No one believes that. Only economists believe that. It may be true, but no one believes it. And it's because people have a different life experience, and because they also have different things they value. It's not just price they value. And so I think that that's going to require the polylateralism that Pascal had mentioned.
Great. Thank you so much for those remarks, Bruce. Who better to talk about consumers than Pradeep? But just before I hand over the floor to Pradeep, this is the last time you'll be hearing from me on this panel. So I just want to thank Lakshmi ji, Jorge, Pascal, Bruce. A real pleasure. And of course, Pradeep, thank you for having me. Over to you to have the gargantuan task of summing up and closing this discussion. Thank you so much.
It would be unwise of me to try to sum up such a rich discussion, except to broadly support the last two interventions. The idea which Pascal spoke about in terms of polylateralism makes much sense. And as I said, there is a living example, the ILO, which can be explored to see how we can take it forward, Pascal. I'm sure, and as Bruce said, now when you talk in terms of consumers, we must understand the distinction between consumers in the rich world and in the poor world. In the poor world, the basic premise is to get jobs. And that is what the WTO preamble also promised, that jobs for everyone. And that is what has also been a cause, as some people said earlier, of discontent with multilateralism, as if globalization was responsible for multilateralism or vice versa. Multilateralism is the the WTO or whichever body we look at, are bodies which are there to provide global governance. World Bank, IMF, etc. We've all heard that. We've seen the kind of historical record of IMF and World Bank as to what they did in Africa, particularly, for example. So the trust factor is what I began with. The trust of the global governance system needs to be rebuilt as far as the people are concerned. The problem now is what I can see from the discussion that we've had is the kind of bipolar world that we are now in. This US versus China, which seems to be dragging so many other things down. And secondly, and let's not forget, gentlemen and Lakshmi, that we do not have leaders. We do not have statesmen. We have politicians governing every country. Populists, for example, Bruce reminded us that many countries are being ruled by populist leaders. They are not statesmen in that particular sense that who can think beyond the beyond 10 years or 5 years or 20 years. That is what is lacking. And in that kind of situation, how do we carry the message of taking forward multilateralism as something which is necessary for global order as well as for global welfare? With that, let me also thank all the speakers once again. Lakshmi, thank you very much for an excellent presentation on the whole history, etc. Jorge, very, very grateful for your very kind thoughts, and particularly coming with the issues of the kind of what Latin America is currently in, as against and praising India's foreign policy, which is what what we have decided to do is, considering the kind of Indo-Pacific alliance, etc., which is developing, is what our Prime Minister has said very clearly. We are looking at strategic autonomy. We are not allies with anyone. We may be friends with people. You must understand the distinction, and that is what we can afford to do, that for what we are and take forward, except that we are battling with many other things. Pandemic particularly has affected the whole world. So a lot of things would depend on as to how the economy is. Indian economy in the last quarter has shrunk by nearly 24%. That's a huge setback. So you can well imagine as to what would be catching the attention of the policymakers currently. And in that context, how do we see multilateralism? This issue about IMF and World Bank coming in again here matters quite a lot. Pascal, great to have you. As always, you have to take Sabina's cue. You have been my mentor for many, many years, and it's been always a great pleasure to hear from you, as well as the fantastic original thinking that you bring, and that will, I hope, be able to guide us in future. Bruce, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Finally, we've got you. We've been trying to get hold of you in a series of webinars that we did on a world without the WTO, for example. You might have heard about it, but we could not get you. Pascal was there in the first webinar. We've already done 5 webinars, and there is a 6th one which is scheduled in the World Trade Forum soon in September. And I would encourage you to come to that, because at least we are trying to, what we do is narrow down to a micro issue in multilateralism as to what is there and what is. We'll be publishing a working paper and send you a copy to have a look and at least comment on it. And with that, let me also thank the wonderful audience. By the way, this is also streaming on YouTube. So there's a lot of audience there, except who have come here on Zoom. And this is being recorded also. So if you would like to see yourself and hear yourself again, you're welcome to do that. The recording link will be sent to you. Thank you very much, and have a good day or a good night or wherever you are. Sabina, final thanks to you. Before I forget to mention that, and you have to do it again. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Goodbye, everybody.
Good night. Goodbye.